I didn't say a word when I saw the bulldozers rolling onto my property. Just outside Asheville, North Carolina, the Reynolds Ranch had been in my family for 3 generations, and now, in the span of a single morning, it looked like a suburban invasion. Vinyl siding gleamed in the early sun, survey stakes dotted the rolling pastures, and workers in hard hats moved with the precision of ants oblivious to the history they were trampling. I'm Ethan Reynolds, 36, Army Corps engineer and lifelong caretaker of these 52 acres. My grandfather, Big Joe, bought this land back in 1961 when Asheville was a quiet town with more forest than concrete, and built a small earthen dam on the northern creek. Simple engineering, precise calculations, and decades of observation went into that dam, and now it was my greatest leverage. The HOA president, Veronica Whitman, appeared like some suburban general. Designer gloves, black SUV, smile that could slice through steel. Her husband, Carl Whitman, had used his city council connections to push through a zoning change while I was overseas. They thought a couple of permits and a public relations stunt would make me give up. They didn't know. I spent the first week documenting every inch: water flow at 3 creek points, dam levels, sediment patterns. My sister Allison suggested I take the lowball offer. I laughed. Money wasn't the point. Legacy was. Preservation was. Veronica escalated immediately. She called local news, claimed my dam was unsafe, and staged a community emergency meeting with cameras and concerned residents. Meanwhile, her crew diverted the creek, dropping the water level and triggering what the EPA would later classify as a Clear Clean Water Act violation. I called Jake Collins at the EPA. Within 20 minutes, he confirmed it. Federal jurisdiction, serious violations, potential felony consequences. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a full-blown legal, environmental, and tactical battlefield, and I had every advantage if I played it right. Over the next 2 weeks, I built my team. Amanda Cortez, a top environmental lawyer, volunteered pro bono. Miguel Ortega, a farmer downstream whose family had used this creek for generations, brought historical documentation. Mrs. Thompson, the oldest resident in the county, became our eyes on the ground. Together, we prepared to show the truth, that the creek, the dam, and my land were under siege, and justice was on our side. Every diverted gallon, every crack in the concrete, every misfiled permit became evidence. And with the storm clouds rolling in for September, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The days that followed felt like living inside a war zone. Only the weapons were permits, spreadsheets, and hydraulic gates. Every morning, I walked the creek, measuring flow rates, checking sediment buildup, photographing the diverted channels. Every night, I reviewed satellite images and county records, tracing the Whitmans' moves like intelligence dossiers. Their plan was predictable: pressure, bureaucracy, and propaganda. I knew this because I'd seen it in Afghanistan. Only now the battlefield was domestic, and the collateral damage was generations of water rights and farmland. Veronica Whitman didn't waste time. She organized neighborhood patrols, volunteers in matching polo shirts, stationed at the property, entrance like some suburban checkpoint. Cameras, license plate logs, petty complaints about noise from the farmhouse. The classic intimidation playbook. I documented everything. Every complaint, every unnecessary inspection, every violation cited on my property that didn't actually exist. By the end of the week, I had a thick binder of evidence ready for legal review. I reached out to Amanda. "This isn't just harassment," I said over the phone. "It's a coordinated assault on water rights, public safety, and federal law." She agreed. We filed emergency motions citing my grandfather's original dam permits, federal oversight, and historical agricultural use. The motion argued that seasonal creek flow had to be restored immediately to prevent ecological damage and preserve downstream water rights. Meanwhile, the community rallied. Miguel brought his neighbors, showing photographs of decades of irrigation fed by the creek. Mrs. Thompson recounted stories from the 1940s of how seasonal flooding replenished soil and sustained wildlife. Small farmers and retired engineers volunteered their time, setting up trail cameras and flow monitors. Every piece of evidence was another arrow in our quiver. The Whitmans tried to play the victim on social media. Unsafe property, troubled veteran, the posts claimed. We're protecting our community from natural hazards. The local paper ran a feature painting me as reckless, a soldier who couldn't adjust to civilian life. I laughed. They didn't understand that I brought something back from the war zone: precision, patience, and the ability to anticipate every move the opposition would make. Storm predictions came in, heavy rains in 72 hours. Amanda coordinated with federal investigators to schedule inspections during that window. I ran calculations for a controlled spillway release: volume, timing, downstream impact, everything. The goal wasn't destruction. It was restoration. It was proof. It was justice flowing through the creek and onto paper, where federal agents, judges, and local officials could see it in black and white. By Friday evening, the Whitmans were panicking. They could sense the storm approaching and their financial and legal house of cards beginning to collapse. I stood on the dam, feeling the wind in the pines, watching the clouds gather over the mountains. The creek, my grandfather's legacy, and the land itself were calling me to act. Rain hammered the hills through the night, thunder rolling like artillery. By dawn, the creek swelled, brown and angry, pressing against the dam with the kind of pressure that made every decision permanent. I stood in my rain gear, clipboard in one hand, phone camera in the other, documenting everything. The water gauges read precisely within tolerance. No overflow, no threat, just power waiting to be released the right way. Amanda arrived with 2 state water inspectors and Tony from the EPA. Their SUV barely made it through the mud. "You ready to make some history?" Amanda shouted over the rain. I nodded, pulling the lever to begin a controlled release. The spillway gates groaned, opening 6 inches. Water roared through like a living thing, carving its natural path downstream. Within minutes, the dormant creek bed came alive. Frogs, herons, and even a pair of turtles appeared as if they'd been waiting for this moment. The inspectors filmed everything: flow rates, soil absorption, sediment movement. Tony grinned. "That's textbook hydrological recovery," he said. Across the road, the Whitmans watched from under an umbrella, faces pale. Their drainage pipes backed up immediately. The water they'd stolen for their development had nowhere to go. By noon, their manicured lawns turned into shallow ponds. Karma doesn't always wait. Then came the sirens. County officials arrived, shouting about unauthorized operation of a dam. But Tony stepped forward, flashing his badge. "Federal authority," he said flatly. "We're overseeing restoration under the Clean Water Act." The sheriff's deputy backed off instantly. Veronica didn't. She stormed toward us, camera crew in tow, screaming about property damage and negligence. Amanda handed her a printed permit and smiled. "You should really read the law before breaking it." That footage hit the evening news, not the version she planned. The story flipped overnight. Local veteran exposes illegal HOA water diversion. Donations poured into the legal fund. Farmers and activists called from across the state offering help. As the rain eased, sunlight broke through, turning the muddy flow into a golden ribbon across the land. For the first time in years, the creek ran free, not just water, but truth, undeniable and unstoppable. By the next morning, the town couldn't stop talking. News crews parked along County Road 7, filming the newly flowing creek as if it were some kind of miracle. But it wasn't divine intervention. It was paperwork, persistence, and patience. 3 things HOAs rarely understand. Maggie tried to spin it differently. On social media, she called me a rogue veteran endangering suburban families. That backfired fast. Veterans groups, farmers, and even environmental activists flooded her comment section, calling out her corruption. Within 48 hours, her PR firm quit. Rick Thornwell, the councilman who backed her, suddenly announced he was taking a leave of absence to focus on family. Translation: the investigation was closing in. Amanda met me at the diner that afternoon with a folder thicker than a phone book. "You're going to like this," she said, sliding over a series of insurance claim documents. Turns out the HOA had falsified their flood insurance applications, claiming they had upstream control over the watershed, my watershed. "That's federal fraud," Amanda said. "And it's enough to freeze their accounts." Tony confirmed it later that night. "We've got probable cause for a joint state-federal investigation. You just gave us the leverage." I didn't smile. Not yet, because I knew people like Maggie and Rick, they don't fold when cornered. They double down. Sure enough, at 2 a.m., headlights flared across my field. I grabbed my flashlight and camera. 2 men in unmarked vests were unloading concrete sacks near the spillway. Sabotage. I hit record and called the sheriff, narrating every second. By the time deputies arrived, 1 man was gone, the other cuffed, mumbling about orders from the top. The next morning, Maggie's lawyer called the sheriff's office claiming routine maintenance, but the video told the truth. The same morning, Tony's team found fragments of the same concrete mix at the creek site, linking the sabotage directly to HOA contractors. That was the moment the tide turned. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about proof, and once you have that, the flood of justice can't be stopped. By noon the next day, investigators swarmed the HOA construction site. Clipboards, cameras, drones, the whole show. Federal environmental agents measured water levels while Amanda handed out sealed copies of our documentation to every official present. No one could claim ignorance now. Maggie watched from her SUV, sunglasses on, phone glued to her ear. She looked less like a community leader and more like a cornered animal searching for an exit. Rick tried to swagger into the site, waving some outdated permit, but Tony's badge stopped him cold. "This is a federal investigation now," Tony said. "You're welcome to observe from the sidewalk." Rick turned red enough to match his tie. Meanwhile, Mrs. Chun had turned intelligence agency of her own. Every HOA board chat, every panic text, every whisper at the local market, somehow she got it first. She'd call me from her rotary phone and say, "They're meeting tonight, 8 p.m. at the clubhouse. Bring your recorder," and every time she was right. Amanda's strategy expanded fast. She didn't just defend. She attacked. She filed whistleblower tips, subpoenaed bank records, and even got a local journalist involved who specialized in municipal corruption. Within 72 hours, the HOA's reputation went from exclusive community to ongoing criminal investigation. But the real punch came when the weather forecast shifted, heavy rains expected by week's end. Nature had joined our side. My engineering instincts kicked in. I recalibrated the spillway gates, double-checked the flow models, and coordinated with the volunteer fire department to monitor levels. If everything went as planned, we'd have a perfectly natural demonstration of how the creek was meant to flow and proof that Maggie's barriers were the real danger. Amanda smiled when I told her the plan. "You're going to let the truth do the talking," she said. That Friday morning, as rain clouds gathered over Willow Creek, I placed a hand on the control lever. "For Pops," I whispered, and began the slow release. The water surged forward, steady and controlled. Not destructive, just right. Cameras rolled. Neighbors watched. And for the first time in years, the creek sang again. By 10 a.m., the first wave of rain hit. The timing couldn't have been better, or more poetic. Federal investigators stood under their umbrellas, watching the spillway release blend seamlessly with the rainfall. "This," one of them said, "is what natural hydrology looks like." I didn't have to say a word. The water spoke for itself. Maggie, on the other hand, was unraveling. She called the local news, trying to frame it as a rogue veteran endangering families. But Amanda had already briefed the reporters. The coverage flipped instantly. Army engineer restores natural creek flow, exposes illegal HOA construction. Even the headline felt like justice. Rick's temper boiled over. He tried to storm across the spillway, waving a stack of cease and desist orders that had no legal standing. Tony intercepted him again. "You interfere with federal agents, you're done." Rick hesitated, looked around at the cameras, and backed off. The crowd laughed, not cruelly, but with the satisfaction of seeing arrogance meet consequence. Meanwhile, the rain intensified. By noon, the controlled flow reached peak discharge. The water followed its natural course exactly as my grandfather had mapped it decades ago. No flooding, no property damage. Just nature correcting an old mistake. Mrs. Chun arrived in her yellow poncho, smiling like she'd waited her whole life for this day. She poured tea from a thermos and handed me a cup. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly. The federal team gathered their measurements and nodded in approval. "This will make one hell of a report," Tony told me. "The HOS going to wish they'd built on higher ground." When the rain eased, the air smelled clean, fresh mud, cedar, and vindication. I shut down the spillway and logged the data. Everything had gone according to plan. But Maggie wasn't finished. That evening, she called an emergency HOA meeting.
Rumor was she planned to sue me for damages.
Amanda just smirked. Let her. She'd be suing the U.S. government by mistake before we're done. We didn't celebrate yet. We knew this was just the first battle in a long war, but the tide, finally, was on our side. The next morning, the fallout began. Local headlines were everywhere. Federal agents investigate HOA for environmental crimes, and Army engineers. Data proves creek diversion illegal. The community that once treated me like an outcast was suddenly waving from their driveways. Even the mailman stopped to shake my hand. Amanda's legal filings hit the court docket like a thunderclap. Within hours, a state judge froze all HOA development activity pending federal review. Rick's construction site went quiet. Cement mixers parked mid-pour. Workers leaned on their shovels, unsure what to do next. You could feel the power shift, the kind that happens when truth finally has backup. Meanwhile, Maggie was losing her grip. She called in favors from every city council contact she had, demanding the dangerous dam operator be arrested. But with the EPA and Texas Water Commission now involved, local officials weren't eager to touch it. Rick stopped returning her calls. The perfect suburban alliance was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. At noon, Tony texted me. "We got it. Federal injunction filed. They can't move a grain of dirt without approval." I stared at the message for a long time. For the first time in months, I could breathe. But I didn't celebrate. I used the quiet to shore up my defenses. I copied every file, every drone video, every document onto multiple encrypted drives. I knew people like Rick didn't go down quietly. They'd try something desperate. That night, I wasn't wrong. Around midnight, headlights flickered through the trees near my property line. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. Two men in work vests were crouched near the lower spillway gate, tools in hand. "Sabotage!" I shouted, and they ran. But not before I caught the glint of a company logo, Rick's construction firm. I called Tony and the sheriff. Within minutes, deputies arrived and took my report. "We'll get them," the sheriff said grimly. I believed him, but I also knew what this meant. They were escalating. The HOA war had officially turned criminal. By sunrise, I was back at the dam with my camera documenting everything. The saboteurs had tried to wedge concrete chunks into the spillway release valves, a clumsy but dangerous move that could have caused uncontrolled overflow. I cleared the debris piece by piece, photographing each one for evidence. Every scrape of metal echoed like a warning. They were willing to risk a flood just to protect their lives. Amanda showed up mid-morning, coffee in one hand and fire in her eyes. "They're panicking," she said. "That means we're winning." She handed me a folder thick with new filings, federal obstruction charges, insurance fraud documentation, and a restraining order request we were filing against the HOA this time. Meanwhile, Tony called with an update. The EPA inspection team was moving up their visit by 24 hours. "We'll have boots on the ground tomorrow morning," he said. "You just keep things stable." That word carried more weight than he knew. The rain forecast was turning ugly. 2 inches expected within 48 hours. If the spillway jammed again, the whole operation could backfire spectacularly. By evening, the property felt like a command post. Miguel and a few volunteers patrolled the perimeter. Mrs. Chun cooked hot dumplings for everyone and made sure nobody left hungry. Even the local fire chief stopped by, quietly offering to look the other way as long as we kept safety protocols tight. Everyone knew this was bigger than one property. It was about integrity. As the sun set, thunder rolled low across the horizon. I stood on the dam, watching dark clouds gather like judgment over Willowbrook Estates. Across the creek, I could see Maggie's BMW parked at the edge of her manicured lawn, headlights on, aimed directly toward my property. A silent standoff between two worlds, one built on greed and concrete, the other on legacy and water. Lightning cracked. For a brief moment, the reflection of her car gleamed in the rising floodwater, and I swear I saw her silhouette gripping the steering wheel, unmoving. Maybe she finally understood what was coming. The next morning, the air was electric, heavy with rain, tension, and purpose. At dawn, I started the generator powering the hydraulic gates. The machinery groaned to life like some ancient beast waking from hibernation. Water surged against the dam, restless and ready. Amanda and Tony coordinated with the federal inspection team on their way from Austin. Their convoy would arrive by 9 a.m. The timing couldn't have been better. By 7:30, Maggie was in full panic mode. HOA members in neon vests gathered at the property line, waving cell phones and shouting about illegal flood actions. I saw Rick pull up in a black SUV, barking orders at a group of workers hauling sandbags. It might have been funny if it weren't so desperate. They were trying to stop nature itself with a few dozen bags of dirt. I radioed Miguel, positioned downstream with cameras and measuring tools. "Flow steady?" I asked. "Perfect," he said. "Natural channels reestablishing just like your models predicted. That was the proof we needed. Controlled release, no flooding, no damage, only restoration." Everything was working exactly as designed. At 8:45, the first federal SUV crested the hill. Maggie ran to intercept them, waving papers and yelling about rogue veterans and property damage. The lead investigator calmly stepped out, flashed credentials, and walked straight past her toward me. "Mr. Morrison," he said, shaking my hand. "We've been briefed. Show us your operation." I led them to the control system, explaining the flow rates, pressure levels, and original 1978 engineering specifications. They nodded, visibly impressed. "This," the agent said, is what responsible land stewardship looks like. Across the creek, Maggie's shrill voice carried through the rain. He's destroying private property. The investigator turned and pointed at the flowing water. That's public property, ma'am. And it's flowing exactly where federal maps say it belongs. For the first time, Maggie went silent. The rain intensified, washing the dust from her carefully curated subdivision. It felt poetic, nature cleansing everything she'd tried to control. By the time the inspectors finished their tour, the truth was undeniable. The dam was stable, the flow was natural, and the only thing broken was the HOA narrative. By noon, the news trucks had arrived. Camera crews lined the ridge overlooking the creek, broadcasting live as the restored waterway shimmered through the rain. Amanda stood beside me, clipboard in hand. Calmly briefing the reporters like this was a scheduled press conference rather than the climax of a years-long battle. Morrison's actions, she explained to the cameras, were entirely legal under the Agricultural Water Rights Covenant established in 1923. What you're witnessing isn't vandalism, it's restoration. That single word, restoration, spread like wildfire through the media coverage. The narrative flipped in real time. Suddenly, I wasn't a troubled veteran or a dangerous landowner. I was an environmental engineer defending historical water rights. Even the Channel 7 anchor who'd parroted Maggie's talking points the week before was now calling it a remarkable act of environmental justice. Meanwhile, Rick's construction crews were ordered off-site by state investigators. Their permits were officially suspended pending review. One of the concrete mixers still sat half-sunken in the mud, abandoned like a monument to their arrogance. When the federal agents finished collecting data, Tony pulled me aside. "We're expanding the investigation," he said quietly. "You were right. They falsified every flood risk assessment. This could go criminal fast." The weight of what he said took a second to sink in. Years of stress, fear, and frustration finally had somewhere to go into accountability. Maggie, though, wasn't done performing. She stood in front of the cameras, makeup running, declaring that our community has been terrorized, but this time nobody was buying it. Reporters asked about the unregistered creek diversion, the EPA fines, and her prior violations in Houston. Her PR mask cracked on live television. As the rain eased into a steady drizzle, I looked down the valley at the creek, flowing freely again, tracing the same path my grandfather had mapped nearly a century ago. The air smelled like wet earth and victory. Amanda smiled beside me. "You did it, Jake." I shook my head. "We did it. Pop just built the dam. The rest of us built the legacy." That night, the town felt different. The hum of construction equipment was gone, replaced by the chorus of frogs and the quiet rush of restored water. Miguel's kids ran along the creek with flashlights, laughing, their boots splashing through puddles that hadn't existed for years. Mrs. Chun brewed jasmine tea over a camp stove, her eyes glistening as she whispered, "The water has memory." It came home. Amanda and I sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the dam. "You realize this case will end up in federal court for years," she said. "I'm fine with that," I replied. "As long as the creek keeps flowing, the rest is paperwork." 2 days later, the EPA released its preliminary report. It confirmed everything we'd claimed: illegal diversion of a natural waterway, fraudulent permitting, and failure to conduct a wetlands assessment. Federal violations stacked up like sandbags before a storm. Rick's construction company shut down within 48 hours. Investors pulled out. The bank froze their accounts pending review of the insurance fraud allegations. Maggie's dream of her luxury development turned to dust almost overnight. When the news broke, the community that once avoided me started showing up with pies, casseroles, and awkward apologies. The same people who'd signed her petition now thanked me for saving the valley. I didn't hold grudges, not anymore. Pop used to say, water doesn't blame the rocks for being in its way. It just finds another path. The federal investigators set up a temporary office in town. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. For the first time in years, people were talking about land stewardship, not property values. The story had become bigger than any of us, a symbol of rural communities fighting back against corporate greed. Late one evening, Amanda came by with a bottle of whiskey. "You know," she said, pouring 2 cups, "you could have just sold the place and walked away rich." I smiled. Maybe, but then who would have taught them that water always finds its way home? By the following week, the scope of the corruption was national news. Environmental blogs picked up the story first, then the mainstream outlets followed. Veteran engineer exposes HOA water theft, read one headline. Another called it the battle for Willow Creek. Reporters loved the David versus Goliath angle. One man with a dam versus a suburban empire built on lies. Rick tried to salvage his reputation with a public statement, but the damage was done. The leaked emails Amanda uncovered showed direct coordination between him, Maggie, and a zoning commissioner to fast-track the development without environmental clearance. When the Fed saw those, they added conspiracy and wire fraud to the list of charges. Maggie's downfall was pure poetic justice. Footage of her yelling at reporters went viral. One clip caught her shouting, "That man flooded my neighborhood," while standing in front of what used to be a concrete barrier, now a perfectly restored stream bank lined with wildflowers. The internet turned it into a meme overnight. Federal agents raided the HOA's offices, seizing hard drives and financial records. Amanda told me the RICO angle was gaining traction, organized environmental and property fraud across multiple counties. "If this goes the way I think it will," she said, "they're looking at real prison time, not just fines." The best part? The city council held an emergency session to distance itself from the scandal. Martinez was appointed interim chair, and his first act was to introduce a motion establishing a permanent environmental review committee for all future developments. For the first time, the town was learning. That night, I sat on the dam's edge with Pop's old lantern flickering beside me. The creek gurgled softly below, steady and calm. My reflection shimmered across the surface, older, more tired, but lighter somehow. This fight had started with anger, but it was ending with purpose. When Amanda called later, she had good news. The feds were officially classifying the spillway and dam under federal jurisdiction again. "Congratulations," she said. "You just made it untouchable." A month later, the courthouse was packed wall to wall with reporters, lawyers, and half the town. Judge Walsh presided, his tone sharp and deliberate. He reviewed every motion, every claim, and when he finally spoke, the entire room went silent. This court recognizes federal jurisdiction over the Willow Creek Dam and its associated waterway. Any interference with its operation is hereby prohibited. You could feel the air leave Maggie's lungs from across the room. Rick stood there pale and sweating as federal agents handed him a thick folder, a new warrant tied to the insurance fraud and zoning kickbacks. Maggie tried to speak, but Walsh shut her down. "Mrs. Thornwell, I'd advise silence unless you'd like to add obstruction of justice to your record." Outside, the crowd erupted. Farmers, environmentalists, and even former HOA members who'd seen the light cheered as the verdict spread through social media. Amanda gave a quick press statement about accountability and federal oversight, while Miguel hugged me so hard I thought my ribs cracked. "We did it, hermano," he said. The creek's free. That evening, I stood by the spillway as twilight settled over the valley. The sound of flowing water was softer now, more natural, weaving its way through cattails and reeds. The air smelled of wet soil and cedar. It was the scent of healing, not just the land, but the people tied to it. Tony called from D.C. "Jake, you started something big," he said. "They're using your case as a model for new federal enforcement guidelines." I looked out at the water and laughed quietly. "All I did was open a gate," he chuckled. "Yeah, but sometimes opening the right gate changes everything." The night ended with community lanterns floating on the creek. Kids splashed in the shallows, their laughter echoing across the valley. And for the first time in years, I felt peace, not the fragile kind that breaks with the next argument, but the kind that comes when justice finally flows where it should. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects were astonishing. News outlets continued covering the story as the federal investigation expanded. Maggie and Rick were now facing multiple felony charges for conspiracy, obstruction, and environmental violations. The construction company's accounts remained frozen, leaving dozens of subcontractors and crews unpaid. The very empire they'd built on deceit was crumbling around them. The restored creek quickly became a symbol of resilience. Local schools brought students to see how water management works in real life. Mrs. Chun's garden flourished again, her vegetables feeding the community, and her story was featured in a regional magazine about sustainable farming. Miguel's family farm, returned to him debt-free, became a hub for workshops on historical water rights and ecological restoration. Amanda continued coordinating with federal agencies, ensuring that any attempt to interfere with the creek would be met with swift legal action. Tony monitored compliance from the EPA, providing real-time guidance during heavy rains. Even the city council acknowledged the lessons learned, instituting new ordinances requiring all developments to undergo strict environmental review before construction. Personally, I found time to restore Pop's farmhouse. Old blueprints guided me as I incorporated sustainable techniques, solar panels, and rainwater collection systems. Sarah returned from California, taking charge of our agritourism business. Together, we hosted farm-to-table dinners, eco-education workshops, and volunteer cleanup events along Willow Creek. The media continued to follow Maggie's downfall. Video footage of her fleeing the courthouse in a storm of flashbulbs became emblematic of corrupt power undone. Rick's sentencing drew nationwide attention, a warning to others who thought they could manipulate systems for profit. Meanwhile, Willow Creek became a case study in water law programs, demonstrating the importance of documentation, community alliances, and responsible engineering. One evening, I walked the dam with Miguel and Mrs. Chun. The creek sparkled in the moonlight, fish darting through the ripples. Miguel smiled. We did more than save water. We saved history, community, and life itself. And in that quiet moment, I realized he was right. This wasn't just about my family's land or even Pop's legacy. It was about a principle, that water and justice always finds its way. By the fall, Willow Creek had transformed into a living classroom. Environmental groups brought interns to document species returning to the restored wetlands. The Audubon Society recorded 12 bird species nesting along the banks, while local biologists monitored the recovery of native plant species. What had once been a dry, diverted creek was now a thriving ecosystem. The community embraced the change wholeheartedly. The annual Creek Days Festival was born, celebrating water, conservation, and local history. Families picnicked along the banks, children built miniature dams in shallow tributaries, and farmers shared lessons learned over generations about sustainable land use. Miguel's daughter, Maria, gave presentations about water rights, inspiring other young people to understand the critical importance of environmental stewardship. Amanda continued her work on federal compliance. Her expertise ensured that any future attempts to manipulate water access were swiftly challenged. The RICO case against Maggie and Rick proceeded through federal court, sending shockwaves across HOA boards nationwide. Developers realized that shortcuts through corrupt zoning or falsified permits would no longer guarantee success. Locally, I became a consultant for communities facing HOA overreach. Calls came daily from small towns and rural areas where water diversion and illegal development were a concern. One provided guidance on documentation, engineering assessments, and legal strategies, teaching others what I had learned firsthand. Even my own property flourished. Pop's farmhouse, renovated with care, became a hub for educational tours. Solar panels hummed quietly on the roof, rainwater fed the gardens, and sustainable agriculture methods were shared openly with anyone willing to learn. Sarah managed operations, blending hospitality with environmental education, and together we created a model for rural conservation-based business. At night, I often returned to the dam, watching the creek flow under the moonlight. The water carried more than just its natural current. It carried justice, community, and a renewed sense of purpose. Pop's journal sat nearby, pages dog-eared and water-stained, reminders of lessons learned over generations. This fight, which began as a personal battle over stolen land and water rights, had grown into a movement. Communities across Texas were inspired to challenge corrupt HOAs, enforce environmental laws, and protect the lifeblood that flowed through their lands. Willow Creek was more than restored water. It was a symbol that even the smallest, most overlooked communities can rise to defend what is right. As winter approached, the lessons of Willow Creek were spreading. Universities contacted me for guest lectures on water rights, federal environmental law, and community action. Students marveled at how a single well-documented dam, combined with legal strategy and engineering expertise, could protect an entire watershed. The ripple effects weren't just academic. Neighboring towns began auditing their own water diversion practices, checking historical deeds, and ensuring compliance with environmental laws. Amanda coordinated workshops teaching citizens how to monitor water flow, document violations, and partner with federal agencies, essentially empowering communities to defend themselves against exploitation. Meanwhile, Maggie and Rick became case studies for what happens when corruption meets federal oversight. Federal sentencing drew national media coverage. Rick was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, and Maggie faced $8.7 million in civil penalties, ultimately declaring bankruptcy. The HOA she'd built dissolved completely, replaced by a cooperative association focused on environmental stewardship and community well-being. Locally, the creek's restoration transformed the economy. Ecotourism increased as kayaking, fishing, and birdwatching enthusiasts discovered the newly revitalized habitat. Mrs. Chun's garden served as a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture. Miguel's restored farm produced record crops thanks to properly managed water flow. Families who had sold properties under pressure from the HOA began reinvesting in the area, drawn by the stability and renewed ecosystem. The annual Creek Days Festival had grown beyond our expectations. Environmental education sessions, local food fairs, and water management workshops became a celebration of both heritage and innovation. Maria Santos, inspired by her family's history and the restoration project, became the first recipient of the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship, studying environmental engineering at ETSMA. On quiet evenings, I still walk along the creek, remembering why this fight mattered. It wasn't about revenge, nor wealth, nor personal recognition. It was about restoring natural order, protecting generational livelihoods, and honoring the legacy of my grandfather, Pops. Willow Creek now flows freely, a living testament to the power of preparation, community, and moral clarity. And in its steady, unrelenting current, I am reminded that justice, like water, eventually finds its way home. The momentum didn't stop with just Willow Creek. Communities across Texas began reaching out, asking for guidance, sharing stories of HOA overreach, illegal water diversions, and corrupt zoning practices. I started compiling these reports, documenting patterns of abuse, and building a network of rural and suburban landowners committed to defending their water and land rights. Amanda's work extended beyond our valley. She filed follow-up complaints and ensured that the federal RICO investigation used our case as a template. Tony continued monitoring compliance, sharing insights and strategies to help communities preemptively secure their water rights. The fight for Willow Creek became a model, a blueprint showing how preparation, legal knowledge, engineering skill, and community solidarity can overcome corruption. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. Pop's farmhouse, renovated with sustainable methods, became more than a home. It became a center for environmental education. Sarah managed the agrotourism side, welcoming visitors eager to see the restored creek, the thriving wetlands, and the gardens that Mrs. Chun had nurtured for decades. Miguel's farm prospered, demonstrating the tangible benefits of responsible water management. We also established the Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship, ensuring that young people could pursue studies in water management, environmental engineering, and conservation. Maria Santos was its first recipient, now immersed in projects that aim to protect Texas watersheds from exploitation. Her generation, inspired by our victory, carries forward the responsibility to safeguard natural resources. The Creek Days Festival grew, celebrating restoration and community resilience. Families came together for hands-on workshops, lectures, and recreational activities along the banks. Environmental organizations recognized Willow Creek as a case study in sustainable watershed management. Media coverage highlighted it as a story of triumph over greed and corruption, a narrative that inspired countless communities. At night, I often stand by the dam, listening to the creek. Its flow is steady and calm, a reminder that even after immense pressure, water and justice always finds a path. Willow Creek's restoration wasn't just about saving a piece of property. It was about protecting a way of life, empowering communities, and proving that vigilance, preparation, and unity can overcome the forces that threaten both land and livelihood. By the following spring, the long-term impact of Willow Creek's restoration was undeniable. The restored flow rejuvenated wetlands, revived fish populations, and brought back native plant life that had struggled under diverted water. Local farmers reported stronger yields, and the community's environmental awareness had never been higher. The story of one veteran defending his family's legacy inspired others to take action before their water and land were compromised. The media coverage evolved from reporting the immediate legal battle to chronicling the broader lessons. Articles highlighted the importance of maintaining accurate water rights records, understanding federal jurisdiction, and building coalitions of concerned citizens. Experts quoted Amanda and Tony, illustrating the interplay between law and engineering and showing how communities could proactively protect their resources. Maggie and Rick became cautionary tales. Their failed attempts at deception and manipulation were studied by law students, city planners, and environmental policymakers. Developers and HOA boards learned that short-term gains through corruption could have long-lasting destructive consequences. Even neighboring states began referencing Willow Creek when drafting stricter water management and environmental compliance laws. Locally, the creek had transformed the valley. Ecotourism brought in new revenue streams, from guided kayaking trips to birdwatching tours organized by environmental societies. Mrs. Chun's garden continued to thrive, now a teaching site for sustainable agriculture, while Miguel's farm hosted workshops for farmers across the county. Pop's farmhouse became a hub for community meetings, environmental seminars, and youth programs. The Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship had expanded to include multiple students each year, promoting education in water management, conservation, and ecological engineering. Maria Santos led initiatives for student-led creek monitoring programs, creating a new generation of environmental advocates dedicated to preventing future exploitation. I still walk the dam most evenings, reflecting on how one decision to defend my grandfather's land and the creek had grown into a movement. The water flows freely, carrying with it not just justice, but a message. Communities that work together, document everything, and combine legal, technical, and social strategies can defend what's theirs. Willow Creek now stands as more than a restored waterway. It's a symbol of resilience, unity, and the enduring truth that, when people fight for what's right, even the most entrenched corruption can be overcome. By midsummer, Willow Creek had become a regional example of what proactive community action could achieve. Environmental organizations cited the creek in grant proposals and studies, highlighting it as a case of successful collaboration between citizens, engineers, and federal agencies. Farmers continued to thrive, their crops benefiting from the restored seasonal flows, and the valley began attracting eco-conscious visitors eager to learn how human intervention could correct past wrongs without harming the environment. The success also sparked broader reforms. Local governments began auditing HOA practices, ensuring compliance with federal water regulations and environmental standards. Amanda's work continued to guide these reforms, providing expertise to prevent future abuses. Tony stayed involved, monitoring compliance and training new EPA field agents on recognizing illegal diversions and water rights violations. Maggie and Rick's downfall had lasting consequences beyond the courtroom. Federal guidelines were updated to address loopholes that HOAs and developers had previously exploited. Their names became synonymous with greed and corruption in local discussions and in case studies at law schools and public administration programs. Rick's 3-year federal sentence and Maggie's bankruptcy served as a deterrent to others who might have considered shortcuts at the expense of community resources. The local community benefited in tangible ways. The restored creek provided clean water to downstream farms, increased biodiversity, and served as a living classroom for students of all ages. Creek Days Festival became an annual tradition, combining environmental education with recreation and community celebration. Maria Santos continued her scholarship work, inspiring other students to pursue careers in environmental law, conservation, and water management. At home, Pop's farmhouse had become a symbol of resilience. Sarah managed operations, hosting workshops, farm-to-table dinners, and tours showcasing sustainable practices. Miguel's farm flourished, serving as a demonstration of proper water management and historical stewardship of land. Mrs. Chun's garden thrived, and her teaching spread to community gardens across the region. Standing by the creek at sunset, I reflected on the journey. From a personal battle against HOA overreach to a regional movement for environmental justice, Willow Creek had become more than water flowing through a valley. It was a reminder that when knowledge, preparation, and community align, even the most entrenched systems of corruption can be challenged and corrected. The final chapter of Willow Creek's story wasn't about legal victories or media coverage, it was about legacy. The creek flowed steadily, a natural, living reminder of what can happen when a community refuses to be silenced. Every morning, the sunlight danced across the water, reflecting years of effort, planning, and sheer determination. The lessons learned spread beyond our valley. Neighboring towns began monitoring their own watersheds, inspired by our success. Workshops on water rights, environmental law, and sustainable engineering became standard, and students who once only read about environmental protection now had a real-life case study in Willow Creek. Maggie's name faded into infamy, a warning to those who thought corruption could outpace accountability. Rick's sentence became a talking point in city councils, teaching officials that legal shortcuts and abuse of power would not go unnoticed. And while the media had initially sensationalized my battle as that of a troubled veteran versus suburban HOA, the narrative shifted. It was now a story about community resilience, environmental stewardship, and the power of preparation. On the ground, life had returned to normal but better. The restored creek supported healthy ecosystems, productive farms, and thriving community spaces. Pop's farmhouse became a hub for youth programs, agricultural workshops, and environmental education. Sarah and I oversaw sustainable farming initiatives, hosting visitors eager to learn about the balance between human needs and ecological preservation. Miguel's farm became a model of responsible land stewardship, while Mrs. Chun's garden inspired a wave of local community gardens. The Pops Morrison Environmental Scholarship continued to grow, supporting the next generation of water management and conservation experts. Maria Santos, now deeply involved in regional environmental advocacy, reminded me every day that our fight wasn't just for today, it was for the future. And as I walked the dam at sunset, listening to the creek ripple over the spillway, I understood the true meaning of our struggle. This wasn't about revenge, fame, or money. It was about doing right by the land, honoring generations past, and giving future generations a chance to thrive. Willow Creek now flows free, a testament to perseverance, courage, and community. Sometimes, the best victories aren't flashy headlines or courtroom wins. They're the quiet moments, watching water find its path, knowing you've helped it and your community flow in the right direction. Justice, like water, always finds a way.